Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Riser. I'm Ted Wyman. I'm joined, as always, by Greg Strong. I'm in Winnipeg. He's in Toronto. And Greg, it comes to mind to me pretty quickly that people in Toronto, the sports fans, are probably having a lot of fun right now. The center of the universe. How is the sports climate there right now, my friend?
Ted, Leaf Nation's very upset. At the same time, I think there's some interesting developments I'm sure we'll touch on with the Toronto Raptors. A big day for them and what's been a big few weeks as that franchise makes some significant changes. And of course, the boys of summer, less than a month until pitchers and catchers report in Dunedin, Florida for Blue Jays spring training. So an interesting time in Toronto.
Impressive positive spin you put on that. I was expecting it to be a bit more doom and gloomy, but good to see. Not too doom and gloomy in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg Jets are tied for first place overall with Vancouver, so there's a lot of sports excitement in this town, and obviously in Vancouver as well, and Edmonton, where they've won 11 games in a row. We're going to touch on all this as we go along on the Riser this week, but it's pretty good time for a lot of Canadian sports fans, and that's what we like to talk about here. And Greg, also, it's been a fantastic year for many of our sports leagues in this country, including the Canadian Football League, which had an excellent season, and the Grey Cup was a big success in Hamilton. And one of the things that happened at that Grey Cup was that our friend Vicki Hall was inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame in the media wing. She became the very first woman to be inducted, given that honor, and it's a very impressive one and very deserving for a great career. And I'm happy to say that we have Vicki with us today as our special guest.
Hello.
Hello, Vicki. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Vicki, and congratulations on the honor of being inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame in the media wing, the very first woman to earn that honor. And I was fortunately at the Football Reporters of Canada breakfast where you made a fantastic speech. It was over a recording, over a Zoom, but it was moving. It moved the whole room. It moved me. It was just such a fantastic way of capturing what it all meant to you. And I think it meant a lot to the people in attendance. So maybe you could share with us a little bit of the feelings that you got when you were told that you would be going into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame.
Well, I don't think I really thought it was real, Ted. I mean, I like to think I'm too young to go into any kind of Hall of Fame. So first, but it's just a huge honor. And the first woman thing, I didn't even realize that at first. It took me a little while. And I think someone pointed it out to me about a week later. And when I realized that, to me, my big thought was to all the women who went before me, because I never saw myself as a trailblazer or a pioneer, because we had women like Judy Owen, Joanne Ireland, Sherry Ford, just so many women who came before me. So to me, when I first started, I didn't think that I was new. Christy Blatchford, who became one of my mentors as time went on and taught me a lot of things. So I didn't think of that, but the fact that I am the first woman just is a huge honor. And to me, I don't think I'm going to be alone for very long. I think that there's going to be more women coming in right away. And I just, to me, that's great. I'm so excited that they're going to join me.
Well, Vicki, thanks for joining us here on The Riser, and congrats on that great honor. I recall talking with you years ago about some of the rather unique characters in football locker rooms. Can you describe what that working environment was like when you were on the football beat?
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking about this today, because when people used to ask me this question, I always was like, well, it's no different for me than any of the guys. I just want to be treated the same. And I always wanted my work to be measured just along with everybody else. I wanted to be a great reporter. I didn't want to be a great female reporter. But I've kind of changed my tune a little bit, because I think it's unfair to the people who are coming up now not to acknowledge that things were more difficult, and things are more difficult for them. I mean, I started when Don Matthews was the head coach in Edmonton. He was very old school. The late Don Matthews is very old school. He didn't really talk to me. There was one offensive lineman on the team that every time he saw me, he would drop his pants. And they all thought it was funny, but if that happened today, I think that would be seen in a very different light. So there were challenges, to be sure. There were people who didn't want me there, and that was difficult. But I remember one time, like I'd been on the beat for CFL beat for, I don't know, about 7 weeks. And I was in Hamilton and it was really hot, steamy hot. And I was in the visiting dressing room there at Ivor Wynn, which was very small. And this guy was like literally gyrating, no pants on behind me and during an interview. And afterwards I was outside. I was actually just trying to cool off because it's so hot in there. And AJ Gass came up to me. He was a linebacker for Edmonton Football Club at that time. And he came up to me and he said, you know, are you okay? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm okay. Like, I didn't want to say anything. I always wanted to just be like, oh yeah, I'm cool. And he's like, if anyone ever bothers you, I want you to come to me. I want you to come to me. I want you to tell us. And I said, okay. And from then on, nothing ever happened again in that room. Like there was always people watching out for me. So there were hard times. Brian Chew, every time Montreal came to Edmonton, and those were fierce rivalries, Brian Chew would see me at the door of the dressing room and walk in with me and help me out. So there were lots of people along the way who helped. But as I said, I think to say that it wasn't hard at times is not fair. So now I am more honest about really what it was like.
Vicki, you've been in the media for a long time, involved in journalism in several different capacities, and you were a sports writer for a long time for Postmedia, Edmonton Journal. I think you started the Regina Leader Post, if I'm correct. And you've, you spanned a lot of years watching the game evolve. And I mean, your career stands by itself, and it's just so fantastic that you were able to make that mark and be recognized in the Canadian Football League. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the state of women's sports in general right now. You know, we've talked a few times on the riser about the Professional Women's Hockey League, how that has risen and is off to a very good start, despite having a short window to get going. And the WNBA has obviously become very big. The Women's World Cup was attracting these incredible full houses for women's soccer games in Australia last summer. Where do you see the growth? And did you even expect to see this 20 years ago when you started out and it was such a male-dominated industry? Did you think you'd see the day when it would be progressing like this?
I didn't, but it's kind of interesting. Near the beginning of my career, I remember I was covering football. I was covering Edmonton, and I was at Clark Stadium, which is right by Commonwealth Stadium. And it was the Women's World Under-18 Soccer Championships. And under 18 or under 20? Under 20, I think, maybe. And it was being played at Commonwealth Stadium, and people thought that no one would show up. And I did not get to cover that, but I was sitting in the press box at Clark Stadium, and I could hear like the noise coming from Commonwealth. And that was Christine Sinclair's coming out party. Like that's where we saw that generation of soccer players. A lot of people met them for the first time, and there was almost a full crowd there. And it was considered this anomaly, like this insane thing, like I think it was Sepp Blatter, like they were shocked. FIFA was stunned that anyone would come out and watch women's football like that. And I think actually in some ways in Canada, that was the beginning. That was the beginning. I regret not being able to cover it. And I remember Jonesy, Terry Jones from the Edmonton Sun used to rub it in my face all the time that I wasn't there. And we're talking about a young women's soccer tournament, but that was the introduction to Christine Sinclair. And now, I mean, like the difference is unbelievable. I mean, when I first started covering it, you never really saw it in the sports section at all, women's sports. So to me, I think it's amazing. I think there's a long way to go. I think they've shown that the appetite's there. Now we've got to figure out a way to meet that appetite and make it more of a daily thing. I think the Professional Women's Hockey League is a great start, but I would love to see it build and for soccer as well, so that girls, when they're growing up now, they don't have to think, oh, that's not for me. Because when I grew up, I certainly didn't think that there was any place for me in sports, but partially because I'm not a great athlete, but also just I didn't think that there was any avenue. So the fact that there is that avenue there now, and it's not just the Olympics once every 4 years, I think it's outstanding and it's great to see.
Vicki, here on the riser, we like to rewind a little bit when we can, go to yesteryear. And in this case, I'd like to ask you about something that happened 18 years ago at the 2006 Turin Olympics. Now, we were in Pinerolo, Italy together to cover Brad Guju's gold medal victory at those Turin Games. And I remember there were several scribes on I think it was a subway or a tram heading back to the main media complex. And I remember we're all furiously pecking away at our keyboards trying to write stories. I don't know if you remember this, but I do remember a line that you said as we were writing, and you said, "This story has the stories we write have the potential to be framed and posted in the rooms of children across Canada. I really want to make it sing." I was wondering if you could tell us about the approach you use when it came to your storytelling and delivering the best written content possible.
Well, you know what's interesting? I wish Bruce Arthur was on this podcast right now, because it would be interesting to hear his viewpoint here, because 2 years later, Bruce and I were in Beijing together, and it was Bruce's first Olympics. It was my second. I was this wily veteran now. And Bruce was freaking out. He was losing his mind. Like, if you know Bruce, he's got a lot of nervous energy anyways. And he was like kind of bouncing around the room and like freaking out and just kind of. And I went up to him, the older, wiser by maybe a couple years person. And I said to him, "Bruce, you're here for a reason. They brought you here for a reason. Do what you do at home. Just do what you do at home. If you try too hard, you're gonna get writers. You're gonna strike out." And I actually think in that story that you were talking about, the Gushue story, when he won and he phoned his mom and everything, I actually, if I went back and looked at that framed piece, I think I'd probably want to hide it in the basement, because I don't think I did a very good job. So I think I learned that if you think about the fact that it's going to go on people's walls and it's going to be history, you might do a very poor job, and you just need to believe in yourself. So that's what I think now, looking back at that, is that, I'm sure that is framed on people's walls in Newfoundland in particular, but I hope it's not my story, because I think I think the fact that I said that to you shows where my mind was, and it was in the wrong place that night. So it's kind of interesting.
I got one more question for you, Vicki, and I was just curious if you always wanted to be a sports writer, if that was something that you thought of when you were a little kid, or if even when you got into the journalism game, if that was where you wanted to, the field you wanted to head into, or if it's just something that came about.
Well, when I was little, I was in Calgary, and Jim Poplinski and Bill Clement were members of the Calgary Flames. They had just moved from Atlanta, and they came to my school. And my family's British, not into hockey at all. And they came to my school, and I went and watched Richard Brodeur and the Vancouver Canucks play the New York Islanders in the Stanley Cup final, and I was hooked, completely hooked. So I used to listen to the sports radio broadcast late at night after the Flames games. When I moved to Edmonton, I would listen to the late John Short, who just passed away. And I'd always want to phone. I would want to phone them and tell them what I thought, but I'd be like, well, no one would care what a woman would think or a young girl would think. And I actually think back then maybe they wouldn't have cared. I really do. But I think I picked up the phone sometimes and I was on hold, but then I would always chicken out. So I always loved sports, but then I became a journalist, and then the door opened for me, and then it was full circle. So to say that I wanted to be a sports journalist, I didn't think that was possible for me. But one day I woke up and I was working with the people who I listened to as a kid. And so to me, sometimes if you love something, I think that life just presents it to you. You end up where you need to be.
Now, that's fantastic, Vicki. I think I can speak for Greg and say we can't thank you enough for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you. And thanks so much for sharing all your insight and those great stories. And congratulations again on your induction into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame.
Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you both on the road at some point in the next little while.
Fantastic. That's Vicki Hall. Thanks very much for joining us, Vicki. Well, what a great conversation that was with Vicki Hall, a friend of ours from all the trails that we've been on over the years in the sports business. Greg, just to see someone be able to earn that trailblazer distinction, is really a great thing. For her to get inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. It's going to be a floodgate now. I think there'll be quite a lot of women that are getting inducted in the future, but someone had to be first, and I can't think of anybody better.
Yeah, Vicki, a great selection for that, a great career, and not only covering football, as we discussed, she's covered a lot of big events, a lot of Olympic Games, a lot of events in in Alberta, in Canada, all over the place. Domestic, international, just a great writer. And so really great that she was able to join us today on the writing.
Yeah, and it's so great to hear how people get into the industry and all those kinds of things. It's always there's so many unexpected stories that come along. So I really enjoy that. But hey, it's time to get into the hot topics of the day in Canadian sports, and I can't think of anything much hotter right now than the way some of these Canadian teams are playing in the NHL. I'll tell you, the Winnipeg Jets and Vancouver Canucks are tied for first place in the NHL at 62 points. Can you think of the last time that happened when two Canadian teams were right there at the top battling for the President's Trophy now that we're past the midway point of the season? And the Edmonton Oilers have won 11 games in a row. I mean, I think two podcasts ago, we were talking about the Oilers already being on a heater, and they're still winning. They've won 11 in a row. It's just really incredible, considering especially how they started. They went through a coaching change. Chris Knoblauch doing a fantastic job there. And, I still don't think the Oilers have the goaltending to be the great contenders for the Stanley Cup. They may have to make that move through a trade, but they're really doing something special. It's a pretty great time for Canadian hockey, as long as you're not one of those Toronto Maple Leaf fans, because it's not looking so good for them lately, is it?
No, it's not. The Leaf Nation very upset as we record. I'm just north of Toronto, and certainly have an ear on sports radio and some of the local outlets, and they are upset. 4-game winless skid. That'll always get people talking, and sure enough, the calls are already going out for what to do about head coach Sheldon Keefe. It's funny you mentioned all those strong Western teams. Didn't mention the Calgary Flames, who cannot be ruled out. They're on a bit of a heater themselves. I tell you, Ted, I think the Western Conference playoffs are going to be fantastic, especially if this CanCon holds up and we get those teams in the mix come spring.
Yeah, I think it would be Winnipeg and Edmonton if it were to happen right now. And that would really be something. They met in the playoffs a few years ago. And of course, have a long, long history of playoff battles, most of them won by the Oilers. Like you said with the Leafs, 21, 13, and 8 at the time that we're recording. Definitely talk of a coaching change because of 4 straight losses and a lot of blown leads. And I'd say we wanted to talk a little about who the winners and losers of the NHL season are here. And I'd say, we've already named some of the winners, certainly Vancouver, Winnipeg, Edmonton. I think Connor Bedard being a rookie sensation. I think Sidney Crosby having 26 goals at age 36 is pretty impressive. But when you come to the loser side of things, the Leafs aren't out of the picture in terms of the playoffs, but they're battling for their playoff lives right now. And I think a lot of people would have expected better. And they're not the only team in Eastern Canada that's struggling. The Ottawa Senators, right near the bottom of the standings, they've been a disappointment this season. What are your thoughts on what some of the highlights and lowlights of this season have been so far?
Yeah, I mean, Winnipeg and Vancouver, I think it would be a safe bet at the start of the season to think, okay, these teams have the potential to have solid campaigns, but being at the top of the overall standings is just next level. So full marks to those teams, definitely winners as far as the midway point of the NHL season go. But of course, you want to be a winner at the end and into the playoffs. So we'll see if those teams can hang on and continue to do so well. Edmonton Oilers, I mean, wow, you talk about your roller coaster seasons. This is the definition of it. And they are on a heater of heaters here at the moment. So we'll see if that can continue. And then here in the East, yes, I mean, it's really been disappointing for all 3 teams. Montreal, kind of in that formative building up for the future kind of stage. The Ottawa Senators, I mean, they've been mired in the Eastern Conference basement for most of the season. The Toronto Maple Leafs, though, with all that high-powered, highly paid offensive talent, just have not delivered. And you can blame injuries. You can blame a lack of depth on the blue line in net. The fact is they're not getting it done. And when I last looked, Ted, in the playoff spot by just 1 point. So it'd really be something if they don't get it together. And they've got this road trip coming up here where they've got a lot of tough teams on the schedule. And then at home and home with your Winnipeg Jets. It's like, top it off.
Yeah, no kidding. And here's some winners for you. William Nylander lands a huge contract to join Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner and Morgan Riley with the Leafs as very, very high paid players. And it's going to be awfully tough for them to navigate that salary cap world going forward. So that's another part that makes it very tough. but good on Nylander for having such a great season when he was due a contract. And how about the Jets? 33 games in a row without giving up more than 3 goals. That's 2 shy of the modern record held by the Minnesota Wild, set in 2014-15. The Jets have now gone 13 games, giving up 2 goals or less. Connor Hellebuck is clearly being touted as one of the Vezina Trophy winners. And it's interesting, that Minnesota team in 2014-15 played in a season that had really low scoring. I mean, Jamie Benn led the NHL in scoring that year with 87 points. Connor McDavid almost doubled that last year. I mean, it's pretty incredible that what the Jets are doing in an era when there's a lot more scoring. Can't say for sure that they can hold on. I'm in Winnipeg. There's a lot of people worried that they could drop back, but right now, playing fantastic hockey. Rick Bowness is going to the All-Star game as the coach from the Central Division, and there's a lot of excitement there. And I'll tell you, among the losers is another guy who has a connection to the Winnipeg Jets. Well, losers in terms of this season. I'm not trying to say anything in particular about this person overall, but Pierre-Luc Dubois, who the Jets got, traded to the LA Kings for 3 players and a draft pick, 9 goals, 19 points in 40 games, and he's minus 10. He's the lowest plus minus on the team for the LA Kings, who are generally a pretty good defensive team, but he really hasn't panned out much for them in the first year of an 8-year contract. And Alex Ovechkin, now he needs 65 goals to pass Wayne Gretzky for the all-time goal-scoring list, which, hey, that's pretty amazing. If he can pull it off, that would really be incredible. But he's only on a 17-goal pace this season. He had 8 goals so far last time I looked. And, at that rate, it could take him 4 years to get to the record. So that is something that's going to be very interesting to watch. Certainly hasn't been the same kind of year for Ovechkin as he gets a little bit older.
It's always amazing to me how you have elite athletes who are used to competing at a certain level for so long, so many years, Hall of Fame level athletes. In other sports, I'm thinking Allen Iverson, Alex Rodriguez in baseball, and now Alex Ovechkin. And it's amazing how it's not like it just stops, but it really slows down quickly when you get into the mid 30s, late 30s in some cases. It's nice players can go into their 40s, but it feels a little bit like Ovechkin is at that point where it's like, maybe the scoring prowess, the numbers, it's just not there anymore. And he can still be a solid NHL player, but the days of 50-goal Alex Ovechkin seasons may be over.
Well, we're lucky here on the Riser that we have a Canadian press writer in Greg Strong, who covers a very wide variety of sports. And one of the things you're pretty knowledgeable about is tennis. So it's the Australian Open right now in Melbourne. And I tell you, that's something I'd really love to go to. It's hot as hell down there in Australia right now, but it just looks like such a fun tournament, a real bucket list one for me to be able to go to that. But pretty rough start for the Canadians. And just what are your thoughts on what's going on with the Canadians in tennis right now?
Yeah, it's interesting, the tennis scene in Canada. I mean, we'll go back to Milos Raonic and Genie Bouchard about a decade ago when they achieved such great heights. I mean, reaching Grand Slam finals. For the better part of 8-9 years, we had Canadians who were in the mix and going deep regularly in these major tournaments. Of course, Denis Shapovalov, Felix Auger-Aliassime, both cracked the top 10 at one point. And then, of course, on the women's side, we look at Bianca Andreescu, who won the U.S. Open in 2019, and Leylah Fernandez, who got to the final at Flushing Meadows herself a couple years later. It was just an amazing time for, when it comes to Canadians in tennis. It have been decades, since we'd had that kind of representation on that stage. And now it feels like we're in a bit of a valley here. When I last looked at the ATP and WTA Tour rankings, Ted, we had one Canadian, that being Auger-Aliassime, in the top 30, at number 30 on the men's side, and Leylah Fernandez, who was in the mid-30s on the women's side. We have one Canadian left as we record this podcast in the Australian Open main draw, which is in the second round as we speak. It's really been a drop-off as far as singles results. And injuries, of course, are a factor for many. Bianca's been hamstrung by injuries throughout her career, really. Felix, seemed like he was battling something most of last season, and Shapovalov missed about 6 months with a knee issue. it's just so tough in that sport to stay healthy, but it's really hammered the Canadians over the last season or two. But that being said, Ted, the results on the team level have been remarkable. Davis Cup victory in 2022, first time for Canada. Then this year, the Billie Jean King Cup, Canada wins that for the first time in that event's history, long history. So fantastic results at the team events. Really solid results in the doubles scene with Gabby Dabrowski of Ottawa, who's been a top 10 player for years and is coming off a US Open title herself. So it's an interesting time when it comes to Canadians in tennis, and we'll see if Felix can go on a bit of a run here down under.
So I also want to talk a little bit about curling today. We do that pretty much every time on the Riser because we've both been curling reporters over a long span of our career. And it's really interesting that in just recent days, Nunavut, it was announced, has withdrawn from the Scotties Tournament of Hearts. That means there's going to be a fourth or a second wildcard team, fourth wildcard team, if you want to look at it a different way. There are going to be 4 teams that are in there that didn't have to win their provincial championships to get through, and then also the defending champion, which is Carrie Anderson, and a couple of teams, new teams, will make it through the Canadian team ranking system. Nunavut is out, and they've never really been in my opinion. It's even when they were there and competed, it wasn't necessarily people who live in Nunavut who were doing the competing, and they rarely had much success. You and I both know that our friend Lori Eddy skipped them for a while, and they did win some games. Lori's from Ontario, and she did have women from Nunavut on her team as well, but at some point this has just been impossible for them to pull off, and now they're not in the Scotties anymore. So is it time, Greg, to rethink that part of the inclusion in the Scotties and Brier? These are great big curling events in Canada. Do we need to make sure we have that provincial and territorial representation all across the board at this moment?
It's an interesting one, and it's certainly on the to-do list for new Curling Canada CEO Nolan Thiessen. I'm sure that's something that he's going to have to examine as we go forward here. Because yes, it's great that we have representation from all provinces, all provincial associations and territories. But it does, I mean, with respect to the Nunavut teams, I mean, I covered the Brier last year when Jake Higgs won Nunavut's first game. That's the 2023 Brier. And that territory had been in the Brier for, I believe, 6-7 years at that point without a victory. 0-42, 0-44, something like that. Higgs finally breaks the streak. On the women's side, you know, they've had a few more victories. Lori, of course, skipped them to a few wins in her run as skip. But, I mean, it's just not a great situation to have a team that has to come into these national championships, play the elite of the elite, and get skunked frequently. It's not a great feeling. It's not healthy, in my opinion, to have teams go out and lose 15-1, 16-0. It's just not a great vibe. So how do you fix it? Well, that's a tough one. And it seems like we have to go every 2 or 3 years and look at a new format for the Brier, for the Scotties. And maybe we have to do that again here to get things rolling. It's unfortunate because in Nunavut, they only have one active curling club in the entire territory. And that curling club, I wrote a little bit about this when they announced their withdrawal. That curling club is not functioning as of earlier this month. They've had rented it out to a movie production studio or something. So even if they had named a team, they wouldn't be able to practice or train in that territory. It's a really unfortunate situation because I'm sure that a lot of the young curlers, that a lot of the young athletes, you know, were really excited to see the Nunavut team get its first Brier win last year and to see the Scotties victories over the years, as limited as they are. That's certainly a good thing. But it's a real problem when you have such limited resources and one curling club.
All right. Well, Greg, we've already talked about one downtrodden Toronto team. Well, not really downtrodden. The Leafs aren't. The Leafs are in a playoff position, so let's not call them that, but they certainly are having some troubles lately. So how about another? The Toronto Raptors. It's a long time ago that they won the championship, the NBA championship in 2019, and things have changed an awful lot. And so much so that after a trade that happened today, on the day that we're recording, there's now just one player left from the organization at that time. Of course, the Toronto Raptors right now sitting at 15-25, barely in the mix for a play-in spot. And now they've traded Pascal Siakam. They recently traded OG Anunoby. It's a revamp entirely, isn't it right now, Greg?
I'd go even stronger. It's a full-on rebuild here. I mean, it's a situation where Masai Ujiri, I think, finally has the opportunity to really gut things and build around Scotty Barnes, their young star player. They've got RJ Barrett in now. They've got Emmanuel Quickley in now after that New York trade. And now today with the reports that Pascal Siakam is on his way to Indiana for, 3 first-round draft picks, I believe a second rounder in that trade. They've restocked the draft cupboard, if you will, even though those first-round picks aren't that hot. I mean, they're going to be in the 20s likely. It's still, if you're at a poker table, you want to have some chips, and now they've got them, right? So it's, I think, something that Ujiri has waited. I mean, since he's been on the job, Toronto's been pretty good. In fact, I really have to think the last time the Raptors rebuilt. They've had so many strong teams for so many years, whether that be Chris Bosh, DeMar DeRozan at the forefront, Kyle Lowry, and then, of course, that impressive 2019 run to the title with Kawhi Leonard being their big gun. It's, I think, an exciting time. It's going to be a couple of years, I think, before the Raptors can get back into the playoff mix. But I think this time, it was overdue, and now they're here. And Ujiri's, he may have some more moves up his sleeve. We'll have to see.
Well, it sounds like a positive when you put it that way. That's for sure. And it really is. If you finally have recognized that the time is to blow it up and rebuild and stock up on draft picks and bring in younger players, then you're on the right track, in my opinion. I mean, it might take longer than people want to see, but it's certainly something that is at least moving forward, because if you're not moving forward, you're moving the other way, and nobody wants to see that. I did want to transition quickly to one of our favorite segments on the show, which is the All-Timers, where we tell some stories from our, how many decades is it in the business? 3? It's been a while.
Count, buddy. Yeah, it's been a long time. You go first this time, Ted.
And I do love it. I love telling these stories because, well, for one thing, I spend a little time thinking about them, because you want to come up with something that actually was memorable and meaningful. Did you say I should go first?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, well, I've been talking for a long time. I hope you don't mind that. This is a funny one. So when I was just starting out covering the NHL in 2012, now the Winnipeg Jets didn't enter the NHL until the 2011-12 season, so it was the first time I had a chance to go. And I went down to cover the Jets in Florida. And as it happens, there was a golf tournament going on nearby. It was the PGA Honda Classic, which is a blast. It's in West Palm Beach, or Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. And it's a real fun event, a lot like the one in Phoenix, which is, all fan based, and it's a real good time. And I was new to it. I'd never covered a PGA event before, so I got a chance to go and do it, and I really, really enjoyed it. But I happened to just be out walking the course, and you've got a nice badge, and you can pretty much go wherever you want. But I didn't realize you were allowed to go inside the ropes when you were a media member. And somebody came along and said, "What are you doing out here? You go walk inside the ropes." So sure enough, I did. So I went under the ropes and I walked in, and I realized I'm on the course with Ernie Els and Rory McIlroy. And there was one other player in the group, and I hate to say it, I can't remember who it was. But I followed them for a couple of holes, and Rory McIlroy was the defending champion at the event. His name was on every single poster in town. He lives in West Palm Beach, or he did at the time, and he's kind of the hometown guy in the tournament. And he was a lot of expectations on him. And I was walking in the group, and he was having a terrible round. I mean, he was playing awful. He had a bad first round. This was the second round, and we were on about the 8th hole, and it didn't look good for Rory to make the cut. And he took a shot, and it went into a bunker. and he pretty much picked up his clubs and walked towards a pathway in the woods that went straight to a parking lot. And there was a couple of Irish reporters following along, and I happened to follow them because if they're going to go and follow him, I may as well follow him too. And followed him out to the parking lot, and he was there, and he just said, "Ah, guys, I just don't have it today. I'm not feeling great." And he got in his car and he took off. And so I was like, does this happen all the time? I have no idea. But at the time, there was no internet out on the course, and I was a Canadian reporter, so I didn't actually have the internet on my phone at that moment. So I had to go back to the clubhouse, and I ran there, and the Irish guys ran there too. I'm going to try to tell this story in some sort of fashion on Twitter, or maybe send in a story to my desk. And by the time I got there, there was a press release from the PGA saying that Rory McIlroy had retired with a toothache, and it was that fast, and it was done so well. But it was interesting because the guys in his group did not know anything about a toothache, and for a while, Ernie Els and the other player were kind of mad that this had happened. But then when they heard that there'd been a reason, they kind of calmed down.
Love it. Love it. For mine, Ted, I'm going to rewind over 2 decades to when I was with Broadcast News, which is the radio television arm of the Canadian Press. The two divisions merged or integrated in the mid 2000s sometime. But in 2001, 02-ish, I was working the overnight desk, I believe, on the Broadcast News side. And we had a Pro Squash Association event in Toronto once a year, featuring 18 of the top 20 players in the world, including at the time world number 1 Jonathan Power, who's a Toronto guy who also lived in Montreal. So I would go down before my overnight shift started at 11 p.m. and I had a media pass, and I would write up a little, what we called a broadcast separate, little 150 word item that would move on the broadcast wire. So I went down and I, do my thing, and I go back to the office, which was a couple blocks up the road, and I opened my email. There were no Blackberries or iPhones at this time, of course, 2001-ish. And I opened the email, and it's a note from the sports editor saying, "Hey, Greg, we're here. You're going to be doing a little broadcast step. Do you mind getting 400 or 500 words together, and we'll put out a little print item on it too?" I'm like, oh my God, I didn't get any quotes. I didn't talk to everyone. So I grabbed my recording device and sprint back down Yonge Street, hoping that I will get there in time to talk to some athletes. Because as you know, you need to get the quotes, you need to talk to the newsmakers. I go into BCE Place, and coming up the escalator is Jonathan Power and Peter Nicol, 1 and 2 in the world at the time. And I knew John a little bit. I'm like, "John, I don't even want, this is like an hour and a half after his match. He's stretched, blah, blah, blah." I explained the situation. He was kind and gracious enough to give me 4 or 5 minutes, talked about the match. Then I talked to Peter Nicol, same thing, went back to the office, banged out 400 words, and we're all set. But it was one of my first assignments, and Jonathan Power and Peter Nicol delivered for me on that night.
Amazing. I would have pulled a hamstring for sure if that had been me doing that sprint down Yonge Street. But good to see that you were able to pull that off. And it showed that, maybe some reporters are in pretty good shape, right?
Well, it was only about 100 meters. So.
Oh, okay. You made it sound like further. Okay, I got you. Anyway, Greg, another fantastic time hanging out here with you on the Riser. We've had Vicki Hall here with us, which was an absolute treat. I want to give special thanks to our producer, Alex Antoniadis, the Toronto Metropolitan University Podcast Lab, our social media intern, Ryan McMahon, our musicians, the Tuesday Night Jam out of Winnipeg. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and please hit that subscribe button when you listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining us again this week on The Riser. We'll talk to you again soon.